The scent of lavender and warm bread did little to mask the coppery temps of life that thrummed through the old house. For Elias, who had walked the earth for 1,000 years, this small, cluttered home was his most sacred sanctuary. He stood at the kitchen window, his movements deliberately slow and human as he washed a dinner plate. The fading evening light painted the world in hues of orange and violet. A daily spectacle he had seen countless times, yet one that never failed to stir a faint, painful longing in his still heart. His family moved around him, a symphony of mundane life he cherished like a holy relic. Sarah, his wife, hummed softly as she dried the dishes he passed her, her mortal warmth a palpable force against the perpetual chill of his undead flesh. In the adjacent living room, their 2 children, Leo and Mia, were sprawled on the rug, their laughter a sound more precious to him than any ancient treasure he had ever plundered. He had crafted this existence with the meticulous care of a master forger. The name Elias Vance, the faint reflection he could just barely force in a mirror. The carefully monitored strength he used to hug his children, all were a fragile dam, holding back an ocean of darkness. He fed discreetly, a predator turned penitent, sustaining himself on the barest minimum from hospital blood bags. A silent pact he had made with himself the day he chose to love a mortal. His gaze fell upon a small, half-healed cut on Leo's knee, a vibrant red against the boy's skin. The scent was a siren's call, awakening a deep, primal thirst that coiled in his gut. His fingers tightened on the porcelain plate, a hairline fracture appearing with a sound only he could hear. For a terrifying second, the civilized veneer cracked, and the ancient predator within stirred, drawn to the simple, vital blood. He closed his eyes, focusing on the sound of Sarah's humming, using it as an anchor to drag himself back from the abyss. When he opened them, his expression was once again that of a gentle, slightly tired father. He placed the cracked plate carefully in the cupboard, a secret flaw in his perfect world. Later, as he tucked Mia into bed, her small arms wrapping around his neck, she whispered, "You're always so cold, Daddy." He smiled, a practiced, gentle curve of his lips that didn't touch the ancient sorrow in his eyes. "I just need a warmer sweater, my love," he lied, the words ash in his mouth. This was his peace. It's a beautiful, desperate lie built on a foundation of suppressed hunger and eternal vigilance. He would burn the world to cinders before he let anything shatter it. But as true night fell, plunging the house into a darkness that felt more like his natural element, a restlessness prickled at his senses. It was too quiet. The usual chorus of night insects had fallen silent. A shadow, deeper and older than the gathering night, was stirring at the edges of his perception. The fragile peace, he knew with a dread that was centuries old, was already beginning to crack. The silence outside was not merely an absence of sound. It was a presence, a heavy blanket, smothering the familiar nocturnal chorus. Elias stood rigid in the darkened hallway, the last vestiges of the gentle father sloughing away like dead skin. Every one of his 1,000 years awoke, a dormant beast uncoiling in the deep well of his consciousness. The air itself tasted different, tainted with the faint, cold perfume of grave dust and old power. It was a scent etched into his memory, a relic from a life drenched in blood and dominion. He moved through the sleeping house, a phantom in his own home. The floorboards, which creaked for any mortal footfall, made no sound beneath his weight. He paused at the doorway of his children's room, watching the steady, vulnerable rhythm of their breathing. The sight of their small throats, pulsing with life, sent a dual surge of protective fury and predatory hunger through him. He clenched his fists, his nails, deceptively human, digging into his palms. At the living room window, he did not part the curtains, simply stood, allowing his heightened senses to paint the world outside. The moon was a sliver, offering little light, but Elias saw everything in shades of thermal heat and life essence. The trees were cool silhouettes. Family of raccoons was a cluster of warm orange blurs near the woodshed, and the deer at the forest's edge were trembling violet shapes. Then he saw it. Or rather, he saw the absence of it. A figure stood at the precise edge where their manicured lawn met the wild woods. It gave off no heat, no discernible life signature. It was a void, a man-shaped hole in the fabric of the night. Elias's vision sharpened, pulling detail from the darkness. The figure was tall, clad in an anachronistic long coat, its posture one of absolute stillness that no living creature could maintain. Pale, almost luminous hands were clasped behind its back. Recognition, cold and sharp as an ice blade, pierced through Elias. This was no random night creature. The arrogant stillness, the specific frequency of ancient energy it emitted, was a herald. A sentinel of the Crimson Covenant. The very coven he had turned his back on centuries ago. They believed him slain in the Great Purge, a forgotten relic. His existence here was a blasphemy to their laws of secrecy and power. The figure's head tilted upwards, and though Elias knew it was impossible for it to see him through the wall and curtain, he felt the weight of its gaze. It was a look of cold assessment, of ownership. It was a reminder that his peace was an illusion, a fleeting dream in the face of immortal memory. As suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow dissolved. It did not turn or walk away, simply unraveled into the deeper shadows of the forest, leaving behind only a psychic imprint, a promise. The night insects remained silent. The air was still thick with the warning. Elias did not move for a long time. The beast within was fully awake now, its thirst a raw, burning thing in his throat. The scent of his sleeping family was no longer just a comfort, it was a vulnerability. The shadow from his past had found him, and it had not come to talk. It had come to survey what was soon to be reclaimed or destroyed. The first move had been made, and the chessboard was drenched in the blood of history. The dawn brought no comfort. Elias had not moved from his vigil by the window, his body a statue of coiled tension. The rising sun painted the world in cheerful gold, a cruel mockery of the dread that had settled in the house like a fine dust. He watched as the world awoke. Birds began their songs. The paperboy rode his bike down the street. The normalcy was a fragile pane of glass, and he could feel the first hairline crack spreading. It was Sarah who found it. She stepped outside to retrieve the morning paper, her robe wrapped tightly against the chill. Elias watched her from the window, his senses hyper-focused. He saw her pause, her body stiffening. She took a half-step back, her hand rising to her mouth. The paper lay forgotten at her feet. In an instant he was at the door, moving with the speed he usually kept chained. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low, a command that brooked no argument. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly curdling into fear. On the pristine white of their front door, a symbol had been smeared. It was not paint. The substance was dark, thick, and congealed, catching the morning light with a sinister, sticky gloss. It was blood, animal blood, his senses told him immediately. A stag from the nearby woods. But the message was no less vile. The symbol itself was ancient, a complex sigil of intersecting lines and a stylized droplet at its center. The mark of claim. It was a declaration of ownership and a threat wrapped in one. In the old tongue, it meant, "You are seen. You are mine." The scent of the iron-rich blood filled his nostrils, awakening the ancient hunger with a violent lurch. His vision tinged red at the edges, and for a moment, the world narrowed to that potent, coppery smell. He fought it down, the effort making the muscles in his jaw stand out in sharp relief. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate taunt. A reminder that his fragile domesticity was a paper shield against the sharp realities of his true world. He turned to Sarah, her face pale. "What is that, Elias?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who would do this?" He could not answer with the truth, could not tell her that a predator from a nightmare had stalked out of his past to stake its claim. He looked from her terrified face to the bloody sigil, a primal rage beginning to simmer deep within him, hot and destructive. This was no longer a distant shadow. It had touched his home. It had violated his sanctuary. The peace was not just fractured, it had been defiled, and the stain was there for all to see. The game had escalated, and the first move had been made in blood. The blood-red sigil was scrubbed away, but its phantom remained, a stain on the soul of the house. Elias had worked with frantic human-like haste, the chemical smell of cleaner, barely masking the memory of iron. Sarah had watched him, her questions hanging thick and unanswered in the air. He had offered only hollow reassurances, the lies tasting more bitter than ever. The children were kept inside, the cheerful cartoons in the living room, a stark contrast to the dread coiling in the hallway. Night fell again, heavier than before, a shroud pulled tight over the world. Elias paced the confines of his home, a caged primordial force. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the settling house, was a potential dagger aimed at his family's heart. He had positioned himself in the living room, his back to the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the windows and doors, a solitary sentinel against the coming storm. It arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper. A sound too soft for mortal ears slithered from the fireplace, a dry, rustling noise, like old parchment being unfolded. Then, from the flue, a small, dark object tumbled out, landing on the pristine hearth with a soft, final thud. It was a scroll, yellowed with impossible age, tied with a cord of woven human hair. The air grew cold, carrying the scent of desiccated roses and tomb dust. Elias moved forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He knelt, the ancient part of him recognizing the ritual. This was formal coven business. This was an ultimatum. With fingers that barely trembled, he untied the gruesome cord and unrolled the parchment. The script was not ink, but a dried, flaking brown. Blood, old and potent. The language was the high tongue of the Crimson Covenant, a language of power and predation he had not read in centuries. The message was succinct, its elegance making the threat all the more monstrous. Elias, once of the Crimson Covenant, your deception is known. Your existence, an affront. Your mortal pantomime, an amusement. The sun sets 3 times from this night. You have until the last light fades. Renounce this farce. Return to the Covenant and pledge your eternal fealty. The mortals within this dwelling will be granted the swift mercy of oblivion. Refuse, and their suffering shall be an epic. It will make you a feast of their terror and chain you with the weight of their screams for the next 1,000 years. Choose wisely, Relic. The past has come to collect its due. The parchment crumbled in his hand, the ancient blood turning to dust. Elias remained kneeling, the words burning in his mind. 3 days, 72 hours to decide the fate of everything he loved. To surrender and watch his family be slaughtered, or to defy his ancient masters and condemn them to a fate worse than death. The beast within him roared, not in hunger, but in a rage so pure it threatened to shatter his human facade, then and there. The fragile peace was not just broken, it had been served to him as a death warrant, written in the only ink his kind truly respected. The scroll's dust still clung to his fingers, a grisly pollen of ultimatum. Elias retreated to the basement, a space of concrete and stored memories, far from the sleeping breaths of his family. Here, the air was cool and still, a tomb-like silence that felt more like his true home than the lived-in rooms above. He did not need the scroll to remember the Covenant's ways. They were etched into his being, a history written in blood and ash. Closing his eyes, he let the memories come, not as thoughts, but as sensory assaults. He was in a torchlit hall, centuries gone, the air thick with the scent of burning tallow and spilled wine. He saw the face of the one who had sired him, Lysander, a creature of terrifying beauty and absolute cruelty. He remembered the feel of his first kill, a knight whose armor had crumpled like parchment under his newborn strength. The hot, potent blood that had filled his mouth was not sustenance. It was a baptism into a world of endless night and power. He had been a prince of that shadowed realm, his name whispered with fear. He had led raids, had torn through villages, not for hunger, but for sport, painting the cobblestones crimson with his passing. The memories shifted, a kaleidoscope of carnage. A monastery silenced, not a single prayer left unfinished, because not a single throat was left to utter one. A rival coven's stronghold put to the torch, the screams of the immolated, a symphony for the victors. He saw Lysander's face not as a mentor, but as a master of puppets, smile a razor cut, as he commanded Elias to prove his loyalty through ever greater acts of depravity. The weight of those centuries pressed down on him, a mountain of skulls. Each life taken, each soul extinguished, had been a brick in the foundation of the monster he had been. The Crimson Covenant was not just a group of vampires. It was a cult of power, a cancer that consumed everything in its path, leaving only dust and echoes in its wake. His love for Sarah, his joy in Leo and Miavis, were not just a rejection of that life, they were the antithesis of it. They were a penance he had never dared believe he could earn. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had gently tucked in his daughter hours before. These hands had once torn beating hearts from chests as a tribute to his sire. The contradiction was a physical pain. The covenant would not just kill his family. They would defile the very beauty of their mortal lives, turning his love for them into the instrument of their torment. They would force him to watch, to participate, to drink from their terror until he was once again the monster he had fled. He opened his eyes, the phantom sense of blood and smoke fading. The ultimatum was not a choice, it was a condemnation. To return was to betray the only true thing he had ever created. To fight was to unleash the very horror he had hidden from his family, the beast he had spent centuries caging. The past had not just found him, it had cornered him, and the only way out was through a river of blood, either his family's or that of the ancient horrors he had once called kin. The third day dawned, the deadline of final, setting sun burning in Elias's mind. It spent the intervening hours in a frenzy of quiet preparation. Salt lines, thin and nearly invisible, were poured along every windowsill and threshold, a paltry ward against beings who cast no reflection. Silver, scavenged from Sarah's jewelry box and kitchen utensils, was hammered into crude, sharpened stakes. His actions were measured, human-like, but his eyes held the frantic energy of a cornered animal. He had told Sarah a story of a threatened ex-business partner, a lie she accepted with a trembling trust that broke what was left of his heart. She kept the children close, their innocent anxiety a sharp, constant pain in his chest. Night fell on the third day, absolute and heavy. The silence returned, deeper this time, a physical pressure against the house. Then it began. It started with a single sharp crack against the living room window. A dead crow, its neck broken, stared inward with milky eyes. Then another thud, and another. A rain of broken animal corpses pelted the house, smearing the windows with gore and matted fur. From outside came a low, chittering laughter that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The lights flickered, dimmed, and died, plunging the house into a darkness that was Elias's oldest friend, but now felt alien and hostile. A sudden, violent impact shook the front door, splintering the wood around the deadbolt. Through the cracks, pale, long-fingered hands clawed, scraping and tearing. Elias shoved a heavy bookshelf against the door, his enhanced strength barely contained. "Get into the basement," he commanded, his voice a guttural roar that was far from human. Sarah herded the crying children toward the basement door just as the kitchen window shattered. A gaunt, gray-skinned figure, all sharp angles and hungry eyes, slithered through the frame. It moved with insectal speed, its gaze locking onto Leo's small, retreating form. Elias moved faster. He crossed the room in a blur, too fast for a mortal eye to follow. The silver steak knife in his hand was a pathetic weapon, but he drove it with the precision of a millennium of violence. It sank into the creature's chest with a sizzling sound. The vampire shrieked, a sound of tearing metal and agony, before bursting into a cloud of acrid dust and boiling blood that sprayed across the kitchen cabinets. The house was under siege. Shadows flitted at every broken window. Air grew thick with the stench of the grave and the ozone tang of unleashed power. Elias stood in the center of the carnage, his wife and children trapped behind him, the scent of spilled blood, both animal and immortal, filling his senses. The fragile shell of the man named Elias was cracking, and beneath it, the ancient warrior stirred. Its wrath a rising tide. The time for hiding was over. The battle for his family's souls had begun, and the first blood of the night already stained the walls. The basement door was their fragile barricade, a thin slab of wood between the nightmare and the heart of Elias's world. He stood before it, his body a shield, listening to the frantic rhythm of 3 mortal heartbeats behind him. Sarah had gathered Leo and Mia in the farthest corner, her arms a desperate fortress around their small, trembling bodies. Her courage was a quiet, fierce thing, a yember glowing in the suffocating dark. She had found an old, heavy flashlight, its beam a shaky sword cutting through the gloom, and clutched one of Elias's makeshift silver stakes, her knuckles white. Elias's fear, however, was a bottomless chasm. It was not fear for his own existence. He had faced final death countless times. This was a terror far more exquisite. It was the paralyzing dread of the strategist who sees an inevitable checkmate. He could hear them now, the hunters from his past, moving through the house above. The soft, scraping footsteps on the broken glass. The low, guttural whispers in the ancient tongue that promised desecration. They were not merely trying to break in, they were savoring the hunt, peeling away his sanctuary layer by layer. A heavy rhythmic thud began against the basement door. Each impact sent a shower of dust from the frame and a corresponding jolt through Elias's body. The wood groaned, a long splinter appearing down the center. Through the crack, a sliver of unnatural, pale face and a single blood-red eye peered in, scanning the darkness before locking onto the huddled forms of his family. A thin, reedy voice slithered through the breach. The little ones smell of sunshine and innocence, Elias. We will taste both. A cold fury warred with his terror. He braced his shoulder against the door, the wood groaning in protest. He could feel their collective strength, a tide of ancient power he could not hold back forever. His gaze met Sarah's over his shoulder. In the stark beam of the flashlight, he saw the question in her eyes, the dawning, horrifying comprehension that the man she loved was at the center of this primordial storm. She saw not just her husband, but the primal fear in his eyes, the fear of an immortal who had found something more precious than eternity and was about to lose it. In that moment, her courage flared. As another blow shook the door, she did not cower. She rose to her feet, placing her body directly in front of her children, the silver stake held out before her like a talisman. It was a futile, beautiful gesture, a moth raising its wings against a hurricane. It was this sight, the utter vulnerability and breathtaking bravery of his mortal wife, that finally shattered something within Elias. His fear did not vanish, but it was consumed, fuel for a different fire. The love that had been his cage became his catalyst. The door would not hold. Hiding was a death sentence. The last vestige of his human pretense was a luxury he could no longer afford. The breaking point was not the splintering wood, but the sight of his family's certain doom, and the realization that he alone, all his horrific glory, could stand against it. The world narrowed to the splintering crack in the door and the frantic, bird-like pulse of his children's hearts. Sarah's brave, futile stance, the silver stake trembling in her hand, was the final, searing image that burned away the last of his resistance. The careful architecture of his humanity, built over centuries, collapsed inward. A sound tore from Elias's throat that was neither human nor beast, but something ancient and terrible. It was a roar of pure, undiluted rage that shook the very foundations of the house. The air around him warped, growing thick and cold. The single, bare light bulb in the basement flared with impossible brilliance before shattering, plunging them into a darkness that was now his element. He did not simply stand, he uncoiled. His form seemed to swell, not in size, but in presence, casting a shadow that drank the scant light from the high, grimy windows. The comforting, familiar features of Elias began to dissolve. His skin, usually pale but warm-looking, became alabaster white, stretched taut over suddenly sharpened bone structure. His kind, weary eyes were swallowed by pools of jet, from which a faint, infernal red light began to smolder. When he snarled, the neat human teeth were gone, replaced by a predator's arsenal of elongated, razor-sharp fangs. The change was not a gentle transformation, but a violent shedding. The civility, the gentle father, the loving husband, they were a cocoon being ripped apart from the inside. The monster he had caged was not just free, it was enraged, its wrath honed by 1,000 years of battle and focused into a single, protective purpose. The door exploded inward. Splinters of wood became deadly shrapnel. The vampire on the other side, its face still fixed in a cruel grin of anticipation, had a fraction of a second to register the abomination that now stood where its prey had been. It did not have time to scream. Elias moved in a blur of motion so fast, it was barely a concept. His hand, now tipped with claws like obsidian shards, shot out. There was a wet, tearing sound, a grotesque parody of ripping fabric, and the vampire's head was separated from its shoulders in a violent arc of black blood. The body had not even begun to crumple to dust before Elias was turning, his burning gaze fixed on the other shapes crowding the staircase. The breaking point was past. The man was gone. The father remained, but now he was a father who was also a primordial storm of teeth and wrath. The siege was no longer about them breaking in, it was about him breaking out. The thing that had been Elias stood between his family and the abyss. its true form unveiled in the wreckage of the basement door. The air itself seemed to recoil from its presence, growing deathly cold and thick with the ozone stench of unleashed power. Behind it, Sarah stifled a scream, dragging the children back into the darkest corner, her mind refusing to reconcile the gentle man she loved with the primordial horror that now occupied the same space. There were 3 of them on the stairs, sentinels of the Crimson Covenant. Their mocking confidence evaporated, replaced by a primal fear they had not felt in centuries. The one in front, a vampire with a face like carved marble, raised a hand, its form beginning to blur as it attempted to retreat into the shadows, its natural defense. It was a futile gesture. The ancient creature that was Elias moved, not with speed, but with a terrible, instantaneous finality, was simply in front of the first sentinel, its clawed hand already buried in the vampire's chest. There was no finesse, only raw, brutal efficiency. With a wet crack of splintering bone, clenched its fist and tore out the still beating heart, a black, shriveled thing that pulsed with stolen life. The sentinel looked down at the void in its torso with an expression of pure astonishment before it crumbled into a cascade of cold ash. The second attacker lunged from the side, a silver dagger aimed for Elias's throat. Elias did not even turn its head. Its free hand snapped up, catching the blade mid-thrust. The silver sizzled against its palm, but the grip did not loosen. With a slow, deliberate pressure, it crushed the dagger in its fist, the metal shrieking as it was compacted into a useless lump. Before the attacker could retreat, Elias's other hand, still dripping with black blood, closed around its head. A single, sharp twist, and the spine separated with a sound like a dry branch snapping. This one, too, dissolved into nothingness. The third sentinel was already fleeing, scrambling back up the stairs into the ruined house. Elias took a single, ground-shaking step forward. Its voice, when it spoke, was a layered chorus of whispers and roars, a sound that promised oblivion. There are no more shadows for you to hide in. It was a statement of fact. The time for stealth, for hiding, for existing in the spaces between light and dark, was over. The pretense was shattered. The being that stood in the wreckage of its own life was no longer a fugitive. It was a force of nature, and its wrath had only just begun. The hunt had been reversed. The creature surged up from the basement, a specter of vengeance ascending into the heart of its desecrated home. The air in the ruined living room grew heavy and cold, the very light seeming to bend and flee from its form. The remaining Coven members, 5 of them, stood amid the shattered furniture and gore-smeared walls. They were ancient, powerful, but in the face of the fully unveiled Elias, they seemed like children playing at being monsters. Their leader, the same tall figure from the woods, hissed a command. They moved as one, a coordinated strike of impossible speed. Elias did not dodge. It stood its ground, and as the first vampire reached it, a transformation more profound than any before shuddered through its body. From its back, erupting through the tattered remains of its shirt, vast, membranous wings unfurled. They were the color of a starless midnight, veined with pulsing crimson, and their span tore the remaining pictures from the walls and sent debris skittering across the floor. One wing swept forward, not as a limb, but as a scythe. It caught 2 of the attackers mid-lunge. The leading edge, harder than obsidian, passed through them without resistance. They disintegrated, not into dust, but into a fine red mist, their essences utterly annihilated. The leader hurled a spear of solidified shadow, a lance that had once felled armies. Elias caught it in one clawed hand, the dark energy crackling harmlessly against its palm before it snuffed out. The ancient power he had kept chained for so long was a tsunami, and the Coven members were but stones before it. The remaining 2 vampires tried to flank him, their movements a blur. Elias's wings beat once, a thunderclap that shattered every remaining window. The concussive force lifted the vampires from their feet, slamming them against the walls with enough force to crack the studs. Before they could fall, Elias was upon them. There was no elegance, only a brutal final punctuation to their existence. One had its head pulped against the fireplace mantel. The other was torn in 2 by a single vicious pull of his claws, a black shower of immortal blood painting the ceiling. The leader, now alone, stared in abject horror. The hunter had become the apocalypse. Elias took a step forward, the house groaning under his weight. His wings stretched to their full, terrifying span, casting the entire room in an eclipse of wrath. The siege was over. The slaughter had begun. Silence descended, heavier and more profound than the preceding chaos. The last of the coven lay as stains upon the ruins, their essence returning to the void. The creature that was Elias stood amidst the carnage, its wings still half unfurled, its claws dripping with black blood. The primal fury that had animated it began to recede, like a tide pulling back from a ravaged shore, leaving behind the wreckage of its own making. The adrenaline of the fight faded, and a new, more terrible awareness dawned. It could hear them, 3 heartbeats thrumming from the basement. But they were not the comforting rhythms of his family. They were frantic, terrified drums beating a staccato of pure panic. Slowly, deliberately, the monstrous form began to recede. The wings folded back into nothingness, the claws retracted. The burning red light in its eyes dimmed to a flicker and then vanished, leaving only the dark, ancient pools. The sharpened bone structure softened, the terrifying presence shrinking back into the familiar, though now forever altered, shape of Elias. He was himself again, but the mask had been torn off and could never be fully replaced. He turned towards the basement door, or what was left of it. He saw the scene through their eyes now, the splintered wood, the gorse-pattered walls, the chilling, otherworldly cold that still clung to the air. He saw himself as they must have seen him, a nightmare-given form, a demon of legend standing in their home. He took a step towards the basement, his movement hesitant, human. A small, broken whimper from the darkness below stopped him dead. It was Mia. He looked down at his hands. They were human in shape, but stained to the wrist with the evidence of the slaughter. The coppery sweet scent of his family's fear was now a poison in the air, far more potent than the stench of his fallen kin. He had saved their lives. He had torn apart the darkness that sought to claim them. But in doing so, he had become the very thing they feared. He had protected their bodies, but in revealing his true heart, the ancient, violent core of what he was, he might have shattered their souls. The true cost of his victory was not measured in the dust of his enemies, but in the wide, horrified eyes of his daughter staring up from the dark. And in the devastating silence of his wife, the battle was won, but the war for his family had just entered its most painful phase. Dawn broke, its weak light filtering through the shattered windows to illuminate the carnage. The house was a tomb of broken memories. Elias had worked through the remaining hours of darkness, moving with a silent, efficient despair. He had cleared the physical evidence of the battle, the ash, the stains of black blood, the splintered furniture. But the scent of violence and the chilling cold of spent power lingered, an indelible stain on the air. Sarah had emerged from the basement first, herding the children ahead of her. She did not look at Elias. Her eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, scanned the ruined living room. The gouges in the walls, the shredded curtains. She saw the story of the night written in the destruction, and the author standing in the center of it, his hands now clean, but his nature exposed. When Leo, clutching his mother's leg, pointed a trembling finger at a deep set of claw marks raked across the fireplace brick, Sarah finally spoke, her voice a ragged whisper. "Were you ever going to tell me?" The question hung in the air, more damaging than any ultimatum. Elias had no answer that could mend the fracture. His silence was a confirmation of every fear. He was a ghost in his own home. When he moved to help, they flinched. Now when he spoke, they stared at his mouth, at the place where Fangs had been. The love that had once filled these rooms was now a frightened, fragile thing, cowering in the corners. The trust that was the foundation of their life together was not just cracked, it was pulverized. He had become the monster under the bed, and now the bed was broken. The monster was standing in the light wearing her husband's face. He had saved them from one horror, only to become another. The siege was over, but the isolation that followed was a deeper, more silent hell. The silence in the broken house was a fragile thing, shattered by a pressure that descended from the night itself. It was not the return of a mere shadow, but the arrival of a storm. The air grew thick and heavy, the scent of ozone and old blood so potent it was a physical taste. Elias, who had been cleaning a shattered window frame, went utterly still. This was not the probing force of sentinels. This was the focused attention of the abyss. From the darkened tree line, figures emerged, not 3 or 4, but a dozen. They moved with a unison that spoke of a single, ancient will. At their center stood Lysander. His form was elegance and decay intertwined, his eyes burning with a cold, solar fury. The failure of his sentinels was not a setback, it was a personal insult. The wrath of the Crimson Covenant was not a mere emotion, then it was a force of nature, and it had come in person to extinguish the embarrassment of Elias's existence. Lysander did not need to speak. His will was a blade that slammed into the house. The remaining windows exploded inward simultaneously. The front door, which Elias had braced with a heavy cabinet, splintered into 1,000 pieces, the wood shredding like paper. The very walls groaned, plaster cracking as an invisible fist squeezed the structure. Elias turned to face them, the weary father once more giving way to the ancient warrior. But the cost of the last battle was written in the strain around his eyes. He had fought to protect a sanctuary that was already broken. Now, he faced not hunters, but an army led by a god. Lysander raised a hand, and a wave of pure force lifted Elias from his feet and hurled him through the wall into the kitchen. The impact was thunderous, a sound of shattering lumber, and Elias's own grunt of pain. This was not a siege, it was an execution. The Covenant's wrath had arrived, and it would not be satisfied with mere death. It would unmake everything he was and everything he had ever loved, brick by bloody brick. Pinned under the wreckage of his own kitchen, Elias felt the crushing weight of Lysander's power. It was a suffocating blanket of pure malice, seeking to grind his bones to dust and extinguish his ancient spark. Through the haze of pain, he heard a sound that pierced the supernatural cacophony. Leo's cry, sharp with terror, and Sarah's defiant shout. They were not cowering, they were fighting. For him, for their home. That fragile human sound was a spark on the tinder of his rage. It was not the wild, defensive fury of before, but something colder, more focused, and infinitely more powerful. This was not about revealing a monster. It was about defending a truth. His love for them was not a weakness to be exploited. It was the core of his strength, the anchor that gave his endless years meaning. With a roar that tore itself from a place deeper than any vampire's thirst, Elias erupted from the rubble. He did not transform into the winged behemoth of before. This was different. Its form seemed to draw in the very darkness, becoming a silhouette of concentrated will. He moved through Lysander's coven, not with bestial savagery, but with the precision of a master who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. He became a storm. He moved among them, and where he passed, ancient vampires simply came apart. A fist through a chest, a head torn from its shoulders, a spine shattered over a knee. Each movement was efficient, final. He used their own arrogance against them, their disbelief at his resolve creating fatal hesitations. He was not fighting for victory, he was fighting for the right to rebuild. He finally stood before Lysander, his sire, the architect of his damnation. The ancient vampire's eyes held a flicker of something new. Not fear, but a dawning, terrible understanding. Elias was no longer the rebellious child or the hiding fugitive. He was an equal force, forged in the fires of a love Lysander could never comprehend. Their final clash was not of fang and claw, but of two opposing truths, one of dominion, one of devotion. And devotion, Elias discovered, was the sharper weapon. When it was over, the house was a ruin, the ground soaked in the blood of the old world, but it was quiet. The wrath had been answered. The sanctuary, though shattered, still stood. And Elias, standing amidst the wreckage with his family watching, knew that the work of rebuilding could now begin. The rising sun found them amidst the ruins. The air, once tainted with grave dust and rage, now carried the clean scent of dew and broken pine from the shattered walls. The silence was no longer heavy with dread, but filled with a fragile, exhausted peace. Elias stood, his form once again that of the man they knew, yet irrevocably changed. The pretense was gone, seared away in the fire of the night. He did not approach them as he once would have, with a comforting word and a gentle touch. He simply stood, allowing them to see him, the blood on his clothes, the ancient weariness in his eyes. the truth of what he was and what he had done for them. He was a creature of two worlds and belonged entirely to neither. Sarah was the first to move. She did not run into his arms. Instead, she walked slowly to the shattered frame of the front door, her hand resting on the splintered wood where the bloody mark had been. She looked from the destruction to him, her gaze not one of fear, but of somber acceptance. The monster had saved them. The husband had lied to them. Both truths existed in the same space, and she had to choose which one to hold on to. She turned to him, her eyes glistening. "No more shadows," she whispered, echoing his words from the heart of the battle. It was not forgiveness, not yet. That would be a long road, but it was a beginning. It was a new covenant, forged in blood and sacrifice. They would not live a human lie, nor would they embrace a monstrous truth. They would build something in the space between, a sanctuary not of hiding but of understanding. Elias was neither just a man nor just a monster. He was their protector, a being who had chosen love over power. And as Leo tentatively reached out to take his stained hand, Elias knew that this fragile, honest peace was stronger than any he had ever fabricated. The war was over. A new life, strange and uncertain, had begun.